How do you know? Good question. When talking to people about whether or not God exists, you may have discovered that people are open to discussing God's existence as long as you don't use the Bible. Last time, we discussed the teleological argument to show how through asking why the universe is the way it is, we can see that it's reasonable to believe in God. Today, we'll be looking at another argument, the moral argument. There has been, in one form or another, a moral argument for God's existence, from the Old Testament to Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and to modern-day apologists such as Craig and Plantinga. The argument consists of two premises and a conclusion, and is as follows. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. In formal logic, this is called modus tollens. If A is true, then B is true. B is not true, therefore, A is not true. The logical equivalent to modus tollens is modus ponens. If A is true, then B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. The argument can be rewritten like this. Premise 1. If objective moral values do exist, then God exists. Premise 2. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What do we mean by morals, or morality? The Oxford Dictionary defines morality as principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. As C.S. Lewis points out in Mere Christianity, everyone agrees that good and evil, right and wrong, exist, even when what is good or evil, right or wrong, is disagreed upon, debated, or contested. This leads to a simple question. Why is there good and evil, right and wrong? Let's look at the argument. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. The first premise is a hypothetical truth-value statement. We see this in the if-then clause. Like all truth-value statements, this hypothetical is either true or false. How dare you say that people who don't believe in God are bad people? Of course they have morals and know the difference between good and evil, right and wrong. I can't believe you would say that people who don't believe in God don't have morals. This is not about belief in God, but rather God's existence. Clearly, there have been many non-theists in the world who have done many good things, and many I know personally who would morally put me to shame. And likewise, there have been many people in the world claiming to be of a particular faith who have committed heinous acts of violence and evil, which seem to be at clear odd with their religion's teaching. Nevertheless, this argument has nothing to do with whether or not belief in God enables you to differentiate between good and evil, but it has everything to do with whether or not God's existence has anything to do with differentiating between good and evil. So this objection really is a misreading and a misunderstanding of the argument's intent and purpose. This is not about belief. It's about ontology, or the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of existence. Well, what about the Euthyphro dilemma? The Euthyphro dilemma? The Euthyphro dilemma. In Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, the title character, is presented an argument by Plato against the reasonableness of God's existence. The question goes like this. Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will something because it's good? The question can be broken down into two parts. First, is something good because God wills it? The implication is that if something is good because God wills it, then God could will evil things to be good. Example, murder could be called good by God. Therefore, we would not know that murder is wrong. We would think it's good because God called it so. The second part, or does God will something because it's good? If God wills what is good, then good is separate from God. This implies that goodness is something distinct from God and is not a part of his character or nature. Therefore, God would not be needed to differentiate between good and evil, right and wrong, because such distinction is not dependent on God's existence. Therefore, humanity would be just as qualified as God to determine what is right and what is wrong. How does a theist respond to this questioning? Well, the question assumes that there are only two possible choices, and thereby commits the fallacy of false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is committed when a person falsely claims that something is an either-or situation, when there's actually at least one other alternative option. Okay then, what's the other alternative option? God wills something because he is good. Wait, now hold on a second. I don't believe that God is good. Now, whether you agree that God is good doesn't change the logic of the argument. When presented with only two options, a third has been presented that is equally plausible and therefore adequately answers the fallacious objection. The Euthyphro dilemma is called out and disqualified as a reasonable objection to premise 1. Ultimately, most agree with premise 1, as it is a hypothetical clause. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. The logical equivalent of this statement is, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. While the first is modus tollens, the logical equivalent is modus ponens. Most atheists will argue that objective moral values do not exist, and if they're correct, then God does not exist. If the atheist claims that objective moral values do exist, well then it logically follows that God does exist. However, just because something is claimed to be true, it doesn't make it so, and this brings us to the second premise. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Well, different societies have different morals and different values. Who are we to say they're wrong? Well, this is a fallacy, the appeal to authority fallacy. This is committed when a person presents information from a false authority or an authority not qualified to make claims about the given topic. Follow me. What's odd is that one of the defining characteristics of being human is that we understand morality. We make moral judgments every day. We say things like, oh, that's terrible, or I can't believe they did that, or they should be punished. These are moral judgments. When a person makes a claim that they cannot make a moral judgment, they're actually committing this fallacy against themselves. They claim that they do not have the authority to make moral judgments about what one society does, but then in the same breath, they claim that they do have the authority to make moral judgments about people who are making moral judgments. And yet, despite the clear absurdity that we cannot but make moral judgments about what other societies do, this claim still persists. As moral agents, we do have the authority to make moral judgments, and whether we want to or not, we all make moral judgments. As I mentioned before, all societies agree that good and evil exists, even if we disagree as to what falls under those two categories. However, the claim that we cannot judge other societies' morals can be easily dismissed through one example. Nazis. Nazis? Nazis. Were the Nazis wrong in their mass genocide of whoever they deemed inferior? Well, of course they were. No reasonable person would be okay with mass genocide as an expression of not liking someone. We all know genocide is evil and wrong, regardless of the reasons you have for genocide. Well, this leads then to another question. Are you saying that the Nazis weren't wrong in their moral values? Pass. Why does this matter? The non-theist has to either admit that mass genocide is objectively wrong, regardless of whatever society commits it, or the atheist has to admit that Nazism is an acceptable standard of moral values, based solely on the fact that it worked for the Nazis. Okay, we need to do what's best for society. Fair enough. Who decides what's best for society? Well, I would think the majority of the people within the society. Ad populum. Ad populum? Ad populum. This is also known as argument to the people, or joining the bandwagon. This fallacy is committed when a person concludes that something is true, based solely on how many people believe it to be true. This can be illustrated by our good friends, Nazis. Nazis? Nazis. The majority of Nazi officials, nationalists, and party members agreed that the best thing for the Nazi society was to have less Nazis. Mass genocide of non-Nazi persons really helped the Nazi societies who don't want non-Nazis in their societies, and that's how they achieved their moral values. Pass. Why does this matter? Because now the atheist has to either admit that just because a majority of a society affirms one moral value doesn't make it a good moral value. Or they actually can't say that the majority of Nazis were wrong and they're wanting to rid the Nazi society of non-Nazi persons. The cliche proverb goes like this: just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right, and what's right isn't always popular. Well, that's just like your opinion, man. The dude abides, the dude abides. What do people mean by this? An opinion is a preference, just a greater personal liking of something compared to another thing. When this is said, the person is trying to say that everything is about preference. Well, if everything is about preference, then there are no objective moral values, and nothing is wrong, and everything is acceptable. If this is the case, then laws don't really matter, because a person could prefer speeding, murder, tax evasion, or abduction, and no one would be able to say that they were wrong for committing such acts. They're just not preferred by some people. Yes, there are laws set in place by societies, but we've already dealt with that. An example would be, rape is now seen as an inconvenience, something that we don't prefer, not something that is morally wrong, since clearly the rapist prefers rape, and the victim prefers not to be raped. If that example bothers you, that's the point. Is all of this just a matter of preference? Pass. No, either there are objective moral values or there aren't. In logic, there are three laws. First, the law of non-contradiction. A truth statement is either true or false. Example, God exists. Second, the law of the excluded middle. A truth-value statement cannot be both true and false. Example, God exists and God does not exist. Third law, the law of identity. A truth-value statement is itself. Example, if God does not exist, then God does not exist. These laws help us navigate through truth-value statements. A truth-value statement is a statement that is either true or false. Questions, commands, nonsense statements, they have no truth value. The claim objective moral values don't exist is a truth value statement, meaning that it's either true or false. It cannot be both true and false at the same time. So either objective moral values do exist or they don't. There is no room for preference or opinions, and it doesn't matter if you dislike the statement. That does nothing to change whether or not it's true. Well, as a neo-Darwinian evolutionary biologist, we believe morals are just the byproduct of our evolutionary development. Now, this is a recent argument, and it proposes that morals are just human constructs that enable societies to flourish and to maintain order that allows for the most reproduction and population growth to ensure the survival of our species. If that's the case, then morals are fabrications. They're helpful lies. If morality is a byproduct of evolution, then morals are not based on good and evil, but survival. This implies that morals are created primarily not to differentiate between right and wrong, or even to provide law and order, but survival. But that's not a moral issue. This idea promotes that morals arise from nature. This is the naturalistic fallacy, which argues that if something is natural, it must be good. Survival is natural, therefore survival is good. We can see that just because something is natural, it doesn't mean that it is good, and that nature is not an immediate guarantor of morality. For example, we see forcible copulation in the animal kingdom often, but when we see it in humanity, we call it rape, and it is morally wrong. This is just one mini example of natural things occurring within nature that humanity balks at because we're moral agents, and we're able to differentiate between right and wrong, good and evil. Again, we may disagree on what is morally good or evil, but the objective differentiation between the abstract concepts of good and evil, right and wrong, exists. So then, where do these concepts come from? Well, since all the objections have been addressed and answered, or the fallacies have been shot down, we arrive at our conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Now, mind you, this is not a God of the gaps theory where we don't know where morals come from, so we pass it off to God did it. Rather, it is the claim that morality is something that exists independently of human comprehension, and our experiences do indicate that everyone adheres to the concepts of good and evil. Why? We are all moral agents capable of making judgment calls. Well, how did this happen? For the Christian, we believe that because God is good, and because humanity is made in His image, that we share this feature of our Creator, this maximally moral being, by being moral beings ourselves. Objective moral values exist because God exists. Whew, we made it. Thank you for sticking through to the end. Soon you'll be ready to use this argument when talking about whether or not it's reasonable for God to exist with your non-believing friends, after a little practice and some possible repeat viewings of this video. I should feel bad, but I don't. Is that a moral judgment? Thanks for joining us today. Next time, we'll look at the 5 apologetic methods. I'm Taylor Drake with 412 Ministries. Happy reasoning and blessings.